Thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you for the organizers for this wonderful workshop, and it's our pleasure to be joining you and giving this talk about where we kind of combine these two areas of sort of a background, what we have been concentrating earlier. So my own related to the climate ethics, and then more about the moral responsibility related to, individual and collective, more broadly related to the climate change. And then Ninni's work on moral and epistemic responsibility. So, and why we thought, so most of people have been talking here about extreme beliefs, and what we wanted to do over here, partly because of this background what we have over here, but also because I was following the discussion about the latest and most recent climate protests in Europe, which seem to be, if you are looking and Googling, quite a lot of there is sort of a kind of that these are quite extreme in a sense. And there's lots of kind of reactions to those. I come to them later on. But still, they seem to be very interesting from the point of view of moral and epistemic responsibility and differentiating and analyzing in the different terms, because they seem to be, in a way, ambiguous on those terms that even though we seem to be thinking them extreme in some sense, there seems to be some kind of acceptability of the goal itself. So it's really about what we disagree, it's about those means, at least to some extent. And then it's not fully clear always what kind of a reaction we do have, and there's over here also in the reactions to those actions and those means, there seem to be some ambiguity. So in some extent it goes to the epistemic more or to the moral, and that's the kind of a starting point for our analysis here. And what kind of protest we are talking about? So here are some of those, and they kind of situate in the ordinary discussion about some sort of political activism. If we put the link over here from the normal kind of what we understand and accept as a kind of conditions of civil disobedience, then we do have a more like, in that sense, extreme or radical, in the sense that they deviate from those conditions in several ways. And these kind of actions, what we have been following in Europe and reading from the newspapers, are those in the art museums, for instance. Then we have in Germany, these group of people in the different cities all over Germany, blocking the streets by gluing themselves, sitting on the street, but also gluing themselves on the street. So constantly, week after week, there is a new kind of a protest like that in Germany, which have accelerated the kind of a criticism against it. But over there as well, it seems to be more about whether the means are too extreme, rather than criticizing or questioning the goal itself. And these are from France, where perhaps the most extreme kind of cases have happening as a part of what we are hearing from Paris at the moment. But on the other parts of the country, there has been this protest, what the group calls itself in English, Earth's uprisings. So these kind of protests, what we are talking about here. So, and what we mean by extreme means here, when we are looking on the background of those kind of a protests I just named to you. So we stipulate in a way that, as I said, there seems to be some kind of acceptance of the goal itself. So mitigating or fighting against climate change or climate crisis even. So some acceptance of the goal, but there is a controversy about the means to achieve those goals. So there's a certain kind of a line that significant number of the supporters of that goal are not willing to cross. What we think about that, that's the line of extreme. It might change from different groups to different to another, but still there's a certain kind of a line, what we stipulate here, that makes certain things extreme or certain means extreme to achieve the goal that all the people or the group accepts. And those means are controversial because there seem to be, at least in certain things, some kind of controversy or disagreement. First of all, about the effectiveness of those means to achieve the goal, and over the balance of choosing the extreme means by balancing the harms and the benefits of those means. And consequently, what we think over here, when we're talking about the responsibility for beliefs of choosing those extreme means, is namely that we are talking about the responsibility of those means concerning the effectiveness of choosing the extreme protests and balancing the overall harms and benefits. And one good example of this, that there seems to be quite strong commitment accepting the goal, but there's then question about whether they are right kind of a means, is the case about when there was a kind of a accident happening during the same time. They had the protest in Berlin, and one cyclist then died. It was not caused by the blockade or the street, the protest itself, but there was a kind of a court case about whether the protest actually blockade also the ambulance that is going to be coming rescue that cyclist, and whether the death was caused by the delay of that ambulance, which then, as it was stand over there, is claimed that that was not the case. But this is from the twin sister of that died cyclist. So she's claiming that she was so distressed having to appear that those activists seem to be accepting that someone might even die as a result of their protest. So that was what she was mostly angry or distressed about, not about that they actually also accepted the goal why they were protesting over there. So that's a kind of an example about, and these kind of cases, that's the way we structure those kind of protests. And then now we're going to offer a certain kind of a framework to analyze the responsibility of those activists in the protests.
Yeah, thank you. Well, listening to the other talks, I realized that my section is going to be a bit heavy on niche philosophy, so by all means read the slides, but I'll try to explain this in more accessible terms so that I can actually get the point across. So you probably remember from Rick's presentation yesterday that the greatest obstacle to thinking about responsibility for beliefs is our lack of control over the beliefs. And as Rick mentions, there's four standard ways, or four standard solutions to that problem. And mine falls within the attributionist line of thinking. So in short, the idea is roughly that given suitable conditions, an agent can be responsible for her acts or attitudes if they are in some way attributable to that agent. And I will unpack that shortly. But on top of that, I will also argue that agents can bear both moral and epistemic responsibility for their beliefs, depending on how that belief was formed. And in order to make that case, I'm going to refer to Angela Smith's three-tiered structure of responsibility. And The idea here is that each lower level is a necessary condition for the upper level, but not the other way around. So it starts with basic responsibility, which is just attributability. And the questions here is just, is X or the act or an attitude attributable to the agent given the conditions? The point is that this is, at this point, this is neutral with respect to normative assessment. So we don't yet need to take any stance on whether X is right or wrong, whether it's good or bad. We just ask whether the agent is accountable, whether she can be held accountable for that act or attitude. And because we don't yet make any normative assessments at this stage, responsibility here just means that we can ask for justification. We can engage the agent in a conversation. That doesn't yet imply anything about blameworthiness or culpability. That only comes at the second level, which is normative assessment. And this is where we start asking questions, whether X complies or breaks certain norms, and which norms. Is the agent culpable for X? Whether she has an excuse. And then at the third level come the proper reactions. How should we respond to X? We could blame or praise the agent, but we could also forgive the agent. So even if we decide that the agent is culpable, that doesn't entail blameworthiness, because we can then decide that maybe it's not worth blaming them, or we just decide to forget them. So we'll go on to explain what I would argue, the conditions of basic responsibility for attitudes. So the idea starts with a very common sense idea that reason-responsive attitudes can be distinguished from bodily states such as hunger and headaches in that they admit of justification. This is not a terribly controversial idea. We all most people accept it. On top of that, I follow roughly Ramnetta's idea, though I put it in slightly different terms, that the necessary conditions for responsibility for attitudes come in two. There's the constitution condition and the manifestation condition, and they are jointly sufficient. The constitution condition basically just states conditions for how the attitude was formed. So this is meant to rule out cases of hypnosis or brainwashing. Those might come in degrees. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But at the extreme, if you are hypnotized to believe something, that belief is then not attributable to you because it's not formed by your own processes. So the constitution condition states the relation between the attitude and the reason that it is a response to. That is a causal and constitutive connection. So the reason causes the agent to have the attitude. But because it also constitutes it partially, this builds the rational connection and the rational pressure to change the attitude in response if the reasons change. If it was merely a causal connection, then the reason could cause the attitude, but there would be no rational pressure to change the attitude when the reasons change. The manifestation condition then says something about how the attitude operates, once it's been formed, how it operates within the larger web of attitudes. So on Netta's view, reason-responsive attitudes also involve dispositions to act, reason, and form further attitudes in light of that attitude. So for example, suppose I look out the window, I see that it's raining. In response to that reason, I form the belief that it's raining. And this belief then comes with dispositions to form further attitudes. So I might feel disappointment. I start thinking, well, where did I leave my umbrella? I start planning on what to wear when I go out, and so on. These are these further attitudes are then manifestations of the dispositions that constitute my belief that it's raining. Now this of course explains why we can have very different responses to evidence. I might feel disappointment that it's raining, Simo might feel relief because it's been so dry lately and it will do good for the nature. And this isn't terribly controversial. It's generally accepted that people do respond to evidence in different ways. But it gets more interesting once you factor in some neurobiological or neuropsychological research on attention and perception, and how those are also shaped by our background attitudes. And what that research shows is that our background attitudes tend to influence attitude formation at somewhat more insidious levels than just what's been generally recognized. So there's a lot of research on how our expectations of how the world is shape color perception, how values, goals, and tasks drive attention, and with attention, they drive our perceptions or how we perceive the world or what information we glean from the environment. Also, what things we tend to remember, how things occur to us. So much so that there isn't really much distinction recognized these days between sort of purely automatic attentional patterns and more agency-driven attention. And now you might think that, well, isn't this irrational to sort of form beliefs based on what you expect the world to be like? But it's not necessarily irrational. That our attention and reasoning is in such ways directed by our pre-existing attitudes is actually necessary for our agency, because, as you know, we're bombarded with all kinds of information all the time. In order to avoid cognitive clutter, we need some ways to discern the relevant information from the irrelevant. But how are we going to make that decision? Well, based on our background attitudes. So if you accept something like that agency is roughly the ability to pursue one's goals, in order to be able to do that, you need the ability to discern relevant information. And so the goal must inform your cognitive processes so that you gather the information that is necessary for your goals and values and tasks. And the actual way that this happens, well, at least according to present understanding, is by way of influencing attention. So this is the biased competition view of attention. In a nutshell, values and background attitudes can influence both what one forms beliefs about, for example, the urgent need to reduce climate crisis, but also how one responds to available evidence, for example, by giving more weight to some evidence over other, some giving more weight to evidence about the harmfulness of climate crisis rather than the risks that extreme acts cause to other people. So here are some examples. This is Simo's specialty.
Yeah, well, they are just a few examples about urgency as a kind of seem to be motivating quite a lot of a certain kind of, as you can see over here, they just cite over there in just stop oil sites that what we need to do over next 3 to 4 years, and also over here. Basically, we know that there is no other way left today but put all forces in the battle to stop the ongoing disaster, and so on. So that at least could potentially be kind of discussed as a potential background attitude informing the the belief formation of those activists.
Okay, so then the second level, normative assessment. Suppose that we agree that the agent carries a basic responsibility for her beliefs. How do we assess it? So I want to distinguish between epistemic and moral responsibility. So even though an agent can carry basic responsibility, we don't yet need to know what kind of responsibility it is. Moral responsibility is usually more, well, it's more common, it's more accessible to people. The idea of epistemic responsibility in this literature is usually tied up with something like being members of an epistemic community. So roughly the idea is that we're social animals and we rely on each other for information. So it makes sense to track who is a reliable informant, who to ask for advice, who's trustworthy, who is not trustworthy. That's the basic idea. That's the sense of epistemic responsibility. So it's not necessarily about blaming someone for their beliefs. It's just keeping track of who is a good informant. Another popular idea is that our reactions to epistemic faults are in some ways different to reactions to moral faults. So moral mistakes tend to be met with emotional responses such as anger, resentment, blame, or guilt. Whereas epistemic mistakes are met with something like criticism, questioning, perhaps reasoning with the person, but then ridicule or withdrawal of trust or an unwillingness to rely on others' judgments. The argument is then that these constitute a genuine form of holding someone accountable for their beliefs. It has been argued that we can look to our responses to deduce which norms have been violated, but I would say that it's not quite so easy. We can look to our responses to deduce which norms we think have been violated, but we don't necessarily know. But if this, what I've said, is roughly right, then that means that beliefs are in principle accessible by using different kinds of norms. And that assessment depends on how we assess the background attitudes that contributed to this formation, or what we think were the background attitudes that contributed to its formation. But this also, of course, means, because we can have different assessments, means that we can have disagreements about the relative norms. So there's a sort of ambiguity of doxastic ought. I have a bit of time, so I'll unpack this a bit. So you probably remember the case of George Floyd, who was killed by a police officer. There was a lot of debate on whether he was innocent or guilty of something. So suppose I say that you are to believe that George Floyd was innocent. The epistemic understanding of this statement would mean something like, looking at the evidence overwhelmingly supports believing that Floyd was innocent. Whereas the moral sense of this would be something like, well, the evidence may be inconclusive, but you ought to recognize the pervasiveness of police violence, how that contributes to problematic encounters between African American men and police officers, and given that, you are to believe that it's overwhelmingly likely that Floyd was innocent, or something like that. So that's a statement that you ought to have certain kinds of moral values, you ought to recognize certain kinds of moral issues that would lend support to believing that Floyd was innocent. But because we can have disagreements over which norms are the right to assess the belief by, it also means that our reactions, for example, to the use of extreme means, may vary from moral outrage to criticizing their rationality.
Yeah, again, this is just kind of a slide examples about this huge reactions in the social media and in the newspapers, but there seem to be kind of that, for instance, which makes those art museum cases, even though they are, to my mind, more closest to the original, the civil disobedience, the kind of even the revulsion against those acts seem to be very strong. And we can discuss about why is that the fact, even though they are strictly, at least announcing that they are not kind of going to damage the painting themselves, which was the case. Actually, if you remember where we started, we did have the Diego Velasco's painting in the very first slide over there, and that was really kind of a 1914 that was destroyed by Mary Richardson suffragette. He really went to the National Museum and cut pieces that painting where the Venus is lying in over there. So, but still, really, and some of them are really saying that they are kind of making kind of an epistemic, to my mind, assessment about what's wrong in their acts, but the very strong revulsion, even outrage against this is strange. Well, the moral and different kind of anger and outrage in the case of the street blockade, it's understandable. The drivers are really getting crazy about that. Again and again, the streets are blockaded, and so they are seeing those people like the pests of society that are nothing to do with us, the normal people, and even in some journalists or editors of the newspapers are thinking that they are kind of an idiot, even though, even in this case, they would kind of say that we accept the moral claim of those actions. So there is a kind of ambiguity, as I said in the beginning, and was highlighted by Ninni there. And so what we should say now about the responsibility of those activists about the extreme means. So on the basis of this three-tier model or the structure, perhaps we could say that they carry moral responsibility if their beliefs about choosing extreme means are influenced by moral beliefs and attitudes. For instance, once they are making the balancing the harms and benefits of their acts. And on the other hand, we can assess that there's nothing morally questionable in their backward attitudes. And it's possible that they are only epistemically responsible for their beliefs. For instance, once they are making the assessment about what the salient facts are about determining how effective their acts will actually be. So there's a kind of we need to be very clear about what we are actually criticizing or reacting to. So our reactions to those extreme means, in the ideal situation, of course, they should reflect how we perceive their responsibility. Do we disagree with their moral values, guiding their belief formation, and thus we would hold them morally responsible? Or do we agree with the values, as it seemed to be in most cases, at least to some extent, at least with the goal, but still we would hold their belief formation questionable and then thus epistemically responsible? But the problem, of course, is that as Ninni said, we don't always know what the background attitudes are and what are the background attitudes that contributed to the formation of those further beliefs and attitudes. So, slightly bit kind of a not very strong claim at the end of here, but still I think we should be very careful in our responses to those extreme acts and not making very strong claims about their responsibility if I'm not very much aware about what really are those targets of our reactions and what really are the background attitudes we are criticizing. So that was actually what we have to say. Thank you. Exactly, yeah, good.